It's kind of felt like it would never get here.
Well, when you were writing it, how much time did you spend over at Desperation Drop versus Inspiration Point?
um, I think a steady back and forth, like any really long project. There's absolutely no just feeling good and firing it off. Back and forth over and over again, and sometimes with the same material. Some days you write something down and it comes out feeling really good, and then you look back over it and you say, oh, I missed something vital, and you feel like a total failure.
Yeah.
But then you fix it, and you move on. But this is it. It has been a process for me. I've written a number of book-length projects. I've done 4 yearly almanacs, sure. They're all about 100,000 words each, which is a lot of words for those of you who don't write book-length projects. That's a book.
To put that in perspective for the average person, like a college essay is 300 words per page. So like a 5-page college that you might have done in college or even in high school, that's like 1,500 words. So maybe a little bit less. So 100,000 words at a professional level is a lot of. There's a massive amount of intellectual bandwidth that went into that.
Yeah. What I was trying to get at was, so I've done long projects before, but the almanacs they're annual almanacs, they're yearly, and so they expire every year. And so this is my first book that won't expire at the end of the year,
Yeah.
which is really, which is a different process.
Yeah.
When you bring something in that, it's like writing in a weekly astrology column. There's a different friend of mine, a great columnist himself, Rick Levine, likens doing weekly columns to doing sand paintings, the Tibetan mandala creation with sand, where they set it up and that it'll be swept away in a couple of days. And the almanacs, even though it's a sand painting that lasts for a year, have that feeling as well. Whereas the 36 Spaces project is really the opposite of that. Not only does it not expire in a year, but the research on it took me back, over 4,000 years. And although even though the point of the book isn't just to describe the history of what people thought about the thirds of each degree, the point was to recover something that's been part of astrology for a long time, and to excavate it, to dust it off, but then also to use it, to test it, and to pass it on to everybody else. So the point was to recover a piece and reintegrate it into the system, but it required going way back. There's a sort of archaeology to it, and so there's this this thread of not permanence, but dealing with something very old and bringing it into the present. By bringing it into the present, hopefully reintegrating it into astrology's future, which just feels really different than doing a yearly almanac. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the reasons, on my side, I try to do what's called evergreen content, which it sounds like what you're doing is more like the word evergreen. It's kind of a weird word, but it's more like a pyramid as opposed to a little hut. Like a hut, you don't intend to live in permanently.
Yeah, absolutely.
But a pyramid is intended to be there for a long time.
Yeah. This felt much more pyramid oriented. But even with something where you work on it for years, and it gets to be big and long, and you assume that you're going to have, you don't need to communicate it in a snappy, quick, eye-catching manner, because it's not it's not like an internet. It's on a news site tagline, right?
Right.
Even with all that space to build, there are still things you can't go into realize that every piece of this could be its own pyramid. And so you have to make choices, right? Just talking about, what were people doing with the decans during the Hellenistic and Roman time period? And you have all of these fascinating lists of gods and daimones and angels and demons and all of these different spiritual fauna that people were associating with the decans and seeing images of through the decans. And, that's a PhD thesis, a thorough reconstruction of just the decans in that era. That's a doctorate. But I couldn't do that. It had to, I had to give that 40 pages and then move on. So, yeah.
Do you want to explain to people, for the folks, anybody out here in Bovinian occupied territory whose astrological literacy has yet to fully express itself, what is the concept of a decan?
Okay, so the decans are also historically called the faces, which is where the title comes from, the 36 faces. It's really simple. The idea is just that each sign has 3 very distinct ways of expressing itself. And basically each sign has a beginning, middle, and an end. And since a sign is 30 degrees, the beginning is 10 degrees, the middle is 10 degrees, and the end is 10 degrees. And that's actually where the decans get their name from. The deck in decans is the same deck in decade, right? A decade is a bundle of 10 years, and a decan is a bundle of 10 degrees in the zodiac. And what's interesting is that people have been using decans from not only just the beginning of horoscopic astrology, there in about 50 BC-ish in the Eastern Mediterranean, but the decans were used by the Egyptians for both secular and sacred purposes since at least 2200 BC. We have coffin lids from that era, which have maps of the decans on them. So it's something with a lot of antiquity, and there's a lot of, like anything old that people have actually used and fed energy into and had a dialogue with, this cutting the zodiac and therefore cutting time and cutting reality into 36 sections has a lot of power. And that's why I got drawn into, and ending up the full book-length project on it. It's something where there's a lot of, not only is it interesting mathematically and it helps make your astrology better, it gives you more detail on a very simple level, right? If you're dividing the circle by 12, and you get the 12 signs, and the signs each give you some descriptive power, right? It gives you some descriptive power for how a planet's going to manifest. If you divide that again by 3, you're literally getting 3 times as much accuracy. So I don't know, they had a that was interesting to me. But what really drew me into the project was that whereas most aspects of astrology are expressed and transmitted verbally, the decans or faces were described for most of their history almost wholly through images. There are all these galleries of 36 images that different cultures used to communicate what that decan meant. And they're generally more complex images than those you see through the signs, right? So, for example, with Cancer, it's like it's a crab, right? And then we go off from there. With the decanic images, you get something like there's a Hellenistic list comes from a book called Liber Hermetis, and for one of the decans of Cancer, you have this image of 2 goddesses gazing at one another, and then between them is a 4-headed dragon, and then 2 of the dragon's heads swoop low, and 2 of the dragon's heads are uplifted. And so you have these more tableaus They're not just one image. They're like these complex tableaus. You're like, okay, so who are these goddesses? What does the dragon represent? What is, there's a lot going on in these images. Or, from the same list, like a falcon-headed and bare-chested man wielding an axe, right? That's more than just a hawk or an axe or a man with an axe. There's a lot going on there. That's obviously an Aries decan, right?
Right.
But so anyway, that just drew me in. I like once upon a time in my teenage years, I wanted to be a painter, and so I've always had a soft spot for the language of imagery. So, yeah.
Does the I think cows, we are I think second decan, or this new cows is going to be a second decan Capricorn. The cows that you are talking to right now is, I think, what was it, a second decan Sagittarius. Do you have any info on either one of those?
On second Capricorn versus second Capricornius. So second Sag versus second Cap.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So those, it's worth noting that those are both middle decans, right? They come in the middle of the signs. And although you can't reduce the decans to cardinal, fixed, mutable, or beginning, middle, end, that is one of the components that makes up their meaning. So they're both in the middle of signs, so there's a steadiness to a certain degree in each. But it's a slightly different fixity of purpose. One of the things I did with all these decanic images is I tried to boil them down in one little symbol, one little item that you could use people could use as a mnemonic to access the range of meanings. And so for the second decan of Sag, I have a horse's bridle. And so the idea with a lot of Sagittarius is that we're looking at the relationship between the willing, intending spirit, right, or mind, I prefer spirit in this case, and the vehicle which can then accomplish that will. Right, we have the old metaphor of the human being as a rider or a driver and a horse or chariot or car, right? So we're talking about ideally the fusion of the rider and the vehicle, hence the man and horse becoming one in Sagittarius, right? Now, the reason Sag takes place, in order to create that fusion, you need a goal, right? You need some reason to connect to opposites. And so, while in the first decan of Sagittarius, you have the sudden appearances. You have the sudden appearance of a quest or a goal, and the seeking out of a proper vehicle. In the second decan of Sagittarius, it's about staying focused on a distant goal, and that focus requires you to maintain that fusion, that syzygy between vehicle or the material means you have at your disposal, including your body, and your intention and your will. And so the image I chose for that was of a bridle, because it's by a bridle that you control and keep the horse moving in a certain direction. A lot of the historical images for that decan show triumphing or standing fast in the face of adversity, and so it's proceeding onward towards what is meaningful, or what has the quest towards what has meaning despite the resistance. But the resistance actually plays a really key role in the second decan of Sagittarius, because it's actually the fire of the friction with the environment that allows that fusion between rider and horse, or spirit and body, or however you want to express that duality. It's only from the heat from that friction gives off that allows that fusion to really take place. So that's the second degree. That's a quick summation of the second decan of Sag. it's more fixed than the other decans of Sag.
Yeah,
Now,
so it's got a little more staying power than.
Yeah, when it's focused on the task of trying to stay, right? It's not staying in one place; it's staying on mission, right? Now, the second decan of Capricorn. It's funny, you've actually brought up the image I use for the second decan of Capricorn, and that's the pyramid. So if we're going to summarize the 3 decans of Cap really quickly, in the first decan of Cap, we pick a piece of land where we're going to build our world, right? If you're a spirit looking over all of matter, you figure out where you're going to descend and become part of the world. Or if you're a seed, where are you going to plant yourself, right? So the first one's kind of about taking territory and knowing territory. And then the second one is about the process of building, right? The process of building something on that territory. The third is about sitting upon what you built as if it were a throne and administering to that part of the world, right? So in the second, even though it seems like a pyramid in the second, it becomes a throne in the third. So in the second decan of Capricorn, what's really necessary, what it highlights are those projects which cannot be achieved quickly and which require the coordination and organization of numerous individuals in order to build something bigger and hopefully lasting. And it's about the project of structuring a little piece of reality. So you can use, pyramid as one metaphor. A cathedral building is another. Nobody builds a cathedral by themselves, right? It takes people acting at various levels. It takes an architect, and it takes various people managing teams of people. And by the way, there's evidence these days that the pyramids were not built by slaves, that people were paid. But there can be a lot of there is by necessity a lot of toil to the work involved in the second decan of Capricorn. There's this funny image from the Yavana Jataka, which is one of the earliest texts of Vedic astrology, and which is a lot of people put it around 3rd century AD. Some people think it's from earlier. But the image for this decan is like this man who's dressed like a knight and who's covered with wreaths in blue flame, and he travels around the countryside building embankments and aqueducts and going over these, creating infrastructure projects as he goes, which is funny. But you have a lot of times in the decans you have a single figure which represents the power of this decan, right? So it's the power to do these projects which shape the land, shape the territory. So anyway,
that seems to make a lot. Yeah, that definitely matches what we're trying to do. So, and it does take a lot more than a lot. It does take a lot of the entire herd moving in a unified direction.
Yeah, the decan, the Capricorn decans, it's especially that middle one. It doesn't matter how great you are at your role. You can't do everything.
Yeah, right? And we're not building a pyramid, but we are trying to build a big antenna.
Mm-hmm.
So speaking of which, folks, then now's a good time to segue into that, Austin, since you did, without knowing it, provided the perfect setup for me to mention our antenna. So our radio communicative version of a giant pyramid, which is our antenna relocation project. Cal's has started a $30,000 fundraising campaign to move our antenna and transmitter to provide a much stronger signal for Forestville, Grayton, Sebastopol, Cotati, Roanoke Park, and Santa Rosa. Help bring your community's voices to the airwaves by donating with your tax-deductible cash, checks, credit card, donated professional services, or construction materials and equipment. As of July 15th, We still need $18,000 to reach our goal. Please use the PayPal button at cows.fm, or you can send a check to Cows Antenna Project, P.O. Box 1073, Occidental, California 95465. Okay, Austin. So, with a different, you got the three faces of each sign. Now, I've looked at things for sun signs where you've got three faces of each sign. Do the other planets, so like Mars in, let's see, what's Mars in right now?
Mars is in the first decan of Scorpio right now.
Right. So so that's going to express differently than in a few days or weeks when it moves into the second.
Yeah, absolutely. The decans are used to add detail to every planet. And then another thing they do, and this is part of their intersection with traditional astrology, is the decans are also said to grant dignity to planets, which means not only do they work in a certain way, they work really well in certain places. And so you get certain combinations that you wouldn't think would work well, but they work really well. For example, Venus is considered to be in her detriment or generally unhappy in Aries, but in the last 10 degrees of Aries, which is her decan, she's considered to rule that decan, you'll see Venus actually fires really very strongly, both in natal charts and by transit. So the first decan of Scorpio is indisputably Mars ruled. There are actually two major systems which allot planets to decans, and they disagree on about 3/4 of them. But the first decan of Scorpio is not one where they disagree. So it's an unambiguously Mars-ruled decan. So Mars is considered not only to be in his own sign in Scorpio because he traditionally rules it, he's also in his own face, right? And so that's a very, very strong Mars. And if you look at the news, it's clear that the god of war, the god of war is, as happy as a pig in poop. So the specific formula of the first decan of Scorpio is, I summed it up in my book with the symbol of a human jawbone. It's about hunger and need and what you are willing to get what you want. It's a very honest and very ruthless decan. The formula, so some of the historical images, Ibn Ezra, who's like 12th century AD, gives us the image of just a crimson woman gorging herself on a feast set before her. Whereas in the Picatrix, which is a little earlier, we have the image of a sort of like a knight or an armed man, and in his right hand he holds a lance, and in his left hand he holds a severed head. And so, part of this project was figuring out what the relationship between these two images is. Which I'm going to throw a third one in there. A number of the tarot cards that most people see, the Rider-Waite deck, which is the most popular deck in the Anglophone world, the 2 through 10s in all of the four suits are actually, those were created, they were created referencing the decans, these traditional images of the decans. So a lot of them are basically interpretations of the decans. And so this first decan of Scorpio corresponds to the 5 of Cups, which is an image of a man gazing at a river and the land beyond it. And he is dressed in black, and he looks down, and you see there are cups spilled at his feet. And it's often called disappointment, or the Lord of Disappointment. So what we have here is basically the relationship between you, what you hunger for, and then the price of pursuing that hunger, right? And so it's Ibn Ezra's image, the crimson woman enjoying the meal. That's the dream of satiation, right? That's the if I had what I wanted, I'd be so happy. right? You would be her, right? Whereas the Picatrix's image, the man with the lance in one hand and the severed head in the other, it shows you what a person might be willing to do to get what they want, right? And so here you have both the implement, right? A lance is not just any weapon. A lance or a spear specifically targets one thing. By stabbing something, you actually acquire it, right? If you stab an apple, then you've got an apple on a stick. It's yours, right? There's a reason, if you look at the glyph of Mars, it's kind of got a little spear point at the end. And so you have this tool for going out and getting what you want, and then you have this severed head, which is kind of ominous, right? And so maybe that was a person who also wanted the same thing. Maybe that was a rival. This is Marshall Decan, right? There's competition. Maybe the man with the lance betrayed somebody to get that. Regardless, the severed head speaks to the price, right? Now, if we look at the Golden Dawn Rider-Waite image for this, which is the disappointed man staring into the river with his spilled cups before him, you have, what that card represents a lot of times is that you get what you want and it's not what you thought it would be, right? You paid the price and you got it and it still wasn't any good, right? Or the price was too high. And so it's the first decan of Scorpio, which is really activated with Mars in that decan, is it's what do you want, what are you willing to fight for, and what will the price be, and are you willing to pay that? And it's not really good or bad, right? It depends, but it's the decan is about really framing that situation into which we're all thrust from time to time. And the answer depends on the situation. It may be better to go hungry sometimes than to follow a hunger, right? And sometimes it may be worth it. Sometimes we have to compete. Not everything is win-win. But Mars in the first decan of Scorpio really, it throws light onto that particular story into which human beings fall from time to time.
Now, it's getting, we're going to take a break, and then when we come back, we talk a little bit, because you said, obviously if you're watching the news, war is unfortunately in the news. The Mars in that first third of Scorpio is also getting a square from Jupiter and Leo. So it's getting expanded, so we'll talk a little bit about that. So we're going to take a little break, and we'll be back in just a moment.